Okay, so you know how it is, like you want to be in the know, right? You want to understand the big picture and everything, but it's like drinking from a fire hose sometimes, right? Too much information.
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming sometimes.
Totally. So consider this deep dive like your secret weapon, your shortcut to being super well informed about this really complex topic. We're going to tackle how to modernize the government. You know, how to inject some serious efficiency, some innovation into the system without, spending hours and hours reading articles and reports.
Exactly. And we got some really cool perspectives for you. We're going to be looking at what Elon Musk had to say in this fascinating interview he did on YouTube with Ted Cruz.
Yeah, that was a good one.
It really was. And then we're going to switch gears a little bit and dive into some conversations from the All In podcast with Howard Lutnick and Scott Bessent. Now, both of these guys have actually spent some time advising the White House, so that they've got, a little peek behind the curtain there.
Yeah, they've been in the room where it happens. So your mission, if you choose to accept it for this deep dive, is pretty simple. We're going to pull out the key ideas from these discussions. We're going to, challenge them a bit, get your critical thinking gears turning, and maybe even explore some alternative ways of thinking about these things. Oh, and of course, we'll try to keep it lively. Maybe even crack a few jokes along the way.
Sounds good to me. Let's do it.
All right, let's jump right in. So let's kick things off with a topic that's always, a hot button issue, government efficiency, or sometimes, lack thereof.
Right.
Elon Musk, in that interview with Ted Cruz, he did not hold back.
No, he did not.
He basically said that the way the federal government accounts for its spending, like if a public company kept its books that way heads would roll, there would be lawsuits galore.
Yeah, he was not impressed.
Yeah, no, not at all. And he dropped the name Sarbanes-Oxley, which, for those of you who don't know, that's a law that holds company leaders accountable for, accurate financial reporting.
Yeah.
So he's saying that the government, historically hasn't even coded its expenditures with much detail. Like they didn't really know where the money was going.
Yeah, that's a pretty scary thought.
It is. And apparently they do now have more detailed coding. But the legacy of that lack of transparency, it's kind of left us with, well, a lot of room for improvement. Let's just say that.
Right.
So what Musk is getting at here is that the very way the government keeps track of its money might be seen as straight up illegal in the private sector. And that's something we should all be aware of. It's a fundamental lack of accountability.
Yeah. And to really drive that point home, Musk threw out a pretty bold estimate. He thinks we could cut $1 trillion in waste and fraud. Just like that.
$1 trillion with a T.
That's a lot of zeros.
It is. Now, what's really interesting is the timeline he gave for this. He thinks we could actually see net savings by fiscal year 2026, which starts in October.
Wow. That's right around the corner.
It is. So, it makes you wonder, where's all this waste hiding, right? $1 trillion.
Right. Like, what are they spending it on?
Exactly. But there's a catch. He did say, provided we are allowed to continue.
Ooh, that sounds ominous.
It does, right? It kind of hints that there might be some, pushback from folks who are benefiting from the way things are currently run.
Right, of course. No one likes to give up their piece of the pie.
Exactly. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Howard Lutnick and his Doge initiative.
Doge.
Oh, like the meme.
Like the meme, like the Shiba Inu dog. But no, this is something completely different.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So Lutnick envisions Doge, as in the Department of Government Efficiency, as a gratis vendor.
Gratis vendor. What does that even mean?
Okay, so imagine this. Instead of the government paying, tons of money for expensive software and consultants, Doge would be like this central hub where companies could just donate these resources. Like they see it as their civic duty.
Yeah.
Or maybe they see, some future benefits down the line. So basically free stuff for the government.
Exactly. Free expertise, free software, all donated.
Huh. That's a pretty unconventional approach.
It is. It is. And guess who he wants to get involved?
Oh.
Elon Musk.
Oh, wow. Bringing him back into the picture.
Bringing him back. So Lutnick is basically saying, hey, Elon, you're a genius at technology and innovation. Come help us fix the government.
Okay, but what exactly are they trying to fix? I mean, what's their goal here?
So their goal is pretty ambitious. They want to cut $1 trillion in government expenses every single year. And they're going to do it by taking a really close look at entitlement programs.
Entitlement programs. Now, that's a whole other can of worms.
It is. It is. But Lutnick made a really interesting point. He said that no one has ever really examined where all that entitlement money actually goes.
Really? No one has ever audited these programs?
Apparently not, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. It's a huge amount of money. We're talking trillions of dollars. And he thinks at least 25% of that is just wasted.
25%? That's a quarter of all entitlement spending? just gone.
Yeah, and he even connects this idea of balancing the budget to, maybe potentially waiving income tax for people making under $150,000 a year.
Now, that would be pretty popular.
Right.
So he's basically saying if we can cut all this waste, we can actually give people a tax break. It's a pretty bold proposition.
It is. So did he actually get any buy-in on this idea?
He did. He said he pitched Doge to President Trump and got an immediate
yes. Wow. So Trump was on board with this.
Apparently so. And the name Doge, you want to know how they came up with that?
Yeah, I'm curious.
It was partly chosen to amuse Elon Musk. Apparently, it's a little inside joke referencing the Defense Production Act, which has some, pretty quirky naming conventions.
Okay, that's pretty funny.
It is. All right, so now let's bring in another voice into this conversation. Scott Bessent, also from the All In podcast. He offers a slightly different perspective.
Okay, I'm listening.
So he agrees that we need to tackle the federal debt and the deficit.
Yeah.
That's priority number one.
Makes sense.
That's a pretty big problem. It is. But he's advocating for a more controlled approach. We don't want to just slash spending overnight and cause a recession.
Right. We need to be careful about how we do this.
Exactly. So their goal is to bring the deficit as a percentage of GDP back to the long-term average, which is around 3 to 3.5%. And they want to do that by 2028.
Okay, so a more gradual approach.
Exactly. Now, Bessent also pointed out a really important historical issue that kind of got us into this mess. It's called rescoring.
Rescoring. Okay, I've never heard of that.
What is it? So basically, it's about properly accounting for future spending when you introduce new programs. When the government creates a new program, they should also be thinking about how much it's going to cost down the road.
Right. That makes sense.
But apparently, this wasn't always done consistently, which has led to what Bessent calls our current spending bulge.
So basically, we've been kicking the can down the road for years.
Exactly. And now the can is like the size of a house.
Oof.
So that's something to keep in mind. This problem didn't happen overnight. It's been building up for decades.
Right. And I'm guessing there are a lot of people who benefit from this current system.
Oh, absolutely. Bessent actually had a great line about this. He said, "It's not their cheese. It's the American people's cheese."
I like that.
Right? It really highlights, the challenges of changing a system where there are so many vested interests.
Yeah, people don't like to give up their cheese.
No, they do not.
Yeah.
Now, Bessent also clarified that the initial savings from these, spending cuts often come from cuts to contractors, not necessarily from, cutting government services or laying off government employees.
Interesting. So the contractors are the first to feel the pinch.
It seems that way. And he gave this really telling example. Some contractors have been on 6-month contracts for over 20 years.
Wow. So like a permanent temporary situation?
Exactly. All right. So let's shift gears a little bit now and talk about how we might be able to, bring some new energy into government through innovation and technology.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
Howard Lutnick actually had some pretty forward-thinking ideas about this.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So he's proposing this initiative where you get these great software companies to essentially donate their expertise and build systems for the government for free.
For free? Like pro bono?
Exactly. Like they're doing it for America. It's their patriotic duty. He even gave the example of a better, more efficient customs processing system.
Okay, so instead of the government, hiring some big expensive contractor, they just get Google or Microsoft to do it for free.
Right. Why not tap into the best minds in the tech industry? And it could be a win-win. The companies get some good PR. They get to, show that they're giving back. And the government gets, state-of-the-art systems without having to pay a fortune.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds good in theory, but would it actually work in practice?
That's the big question, right? And Scott Bessent kind of hinted at why this might be necessary. He was talking about how outdated a lot of government IT infrastructure is. He actually used the term Cobalt mainframe.
Cobalt mainframes.
Yeah.
Wow. That sounds ancient.
It does, right? Like something you'd find in a museum, not running critical government operations.
So they're basically running on technology from the Stone Age.
Pretty much. And Bessent explained that one of the reasons why the government has been so slow to adopt new software is because of this change in accounting practices back in the mid-1970s.
What kind of change?
So back then, they started doing these 10-year upfront contracts for software.
10 years up front. That seems crazy.
It does, right? Who knows what technology is going to be like in 10 years?
Exactly. But I guess back then it made sense.
I guess so. But the problem is that when you have to budget for a decade of software costs up front, you're not really incentivized to try something new.
Right. You're stuck with what you've got.
Exactly. Now, speaking of new technology, we can't have this conversation without talking about artificial intelligence.
Ah, yes, AI. The elephant in the room, or maybe the robot in the room.
The robot in the room, exactly. Yeah. And Elon Musk had some pretty interesting things to say about this.
I bet he did.
So his predictions for the next decade are pretty mind-blowing. He believes that in 10 years, AI could be better than humans at almost everything.
Everything. Like every single task.
Pretty much. Like he's talking about cognitive abilities. You know, problem-solving, decision-making, creativity, all of it. AI will be better than us.
Wow, that's a pretty bold prediction.
It is. It is. And he also thinks that we're going to see a massive increase in the number of humanoid robots.
Humanoid robots, like walking, talking robots.
Exactly. So, get ready for the robot revolution, or maybe just some really helpful robot assistants. Time will tell.
Yeah, that's either really exciting or really terrifying, depending on how you look at it.
Right. But there's a catch with all this AI stuff, and it's a big one.
Okay, I'm listening.
It all comes down to who controls the AI chip fabrication.
AI chip fabrication. Okay, explain that one to me.
So basically, these are the chips that power all the AI systems. Right now, Taiwan is the dominant player in this field.
Taiwan.
So Musk is really worried about what would happen if China were to invade Taiwan.
Right, because then China would control the global AI chip supply.
Exactly. And he sees this as a huge national security issue. He doesn't think we're taking it seriously enough.
So we're basically putting all our eggs in Taiwan's basket.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And Musk is saying that we need to diversify our supply chain. We need to start making these chips ourselves.
Makes sense. We can't be dependent on another country for something this important.
Exactly. All right, so let's switch gears again and talk about some of the more unconventional ideas for generating revenue and, stimulating the economy.
Okay, this should be interesting.
Howard Lutnick brought up this concept called the Trump card.
The Trump card?
Okay.
I'm intrigued. What is that?
So imagine this. It's basically a rebranded green card. But instead of being free or, relatively inexpensive, it would cost $5 million.
$5 million.
For a green card.
Yes, and it would grant you the right to live in America.
So you're basically buying your way into the country.
Exactly. And Lutnick estimates that there are about 37 million people globally who could actually afford this.
37 million people. Wow.
And President Trump apparently thinks they could sell 1 million of these cards.
1 million cards. That's $5 trillion. Exactly. So it's a pretty significant chunk of change. Now, the interesting thing is that these card holders would only pay U.S. income tax on income earned in the U.S., not on their global income.
So they get a bit of a tax break.
Exactly. And reportedly, Elon Musk is even developing the software for this whole Trump card initiative.
Wow. So Musk is involved in this too.
It seems so. Okay, now let's talk about tariffs. Because Lutnick had some pretty strong opinions about this.
Tariffs? Aren't those kind of controversial?
They are. But Lutnick argues that America was actually built on tariffs. Like, we didn't even have an income tax until 1913.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yep. And he doesn't believe in this idea of truly free and fair trade. He says that no country actually practices it.
Interesting. So he's kind of a protectionist.
You could say that. And he also has a different view on inflation. He thinks it's caused by increasing the money supply, not by tariffs directly affecting the price of goods.
So he's saying that tariffs don't actually cause inflation.
That's his argument. And he thinks that tariffs could actually generate a lot of revenue for the U.S. government.
Okay, so it's a different way of thinking about economics.
It is. All right, now let's talk about Scott Bessent and his idea for a sovereign wealth fund for the United States.
A sovereign wealth fund?
Yeah.
Okay, I've heard of those. But what would that look like for the U.S.?
So Bessent's idea is that the U.S. government would basically leverage its huge purchasing power. We're talking about the biggest customer in the world.
Right. The government buys a lot of stuff.
They do. And Bessent thinks that they could use that power to negotiate better deals and even to get equity stakes in companies.
Equity stakes, like owning part of the company.
Exactly. He gave the example of negotiating warrants on large vaccine orders.
Warrants. So like the option to buy stock at a certain price in the future?
Exactly. And it's kind of like a venture capitalist.
Yeah.
But on a massive scale.
So the government would be like a giant venture capital firm.
Exactly. And Bessent compared this to the Australian Superannuation Fund, which manages a huge amount of assets with a relatively small staff.
Interesting. So it's a proven model.
It seems to be. And Bessent also thinks that the government could leverage its land holdings, all the land that the government owns.
Right, like national parks and stuff.
Exactly. And he thinks they could use that land to generate revenue, maybe by leasing it out or developing it.
Okay. That's an interesting idea.
It is. It is. Now, Besson also acknowledges that there are, pros and cons to this whole sovereign wealth fund idea.
Right. There are always trade-offs.
Exactly. But he thinks that it's something worth exploring. And apparently, they're actually forming a study group to look into it.
Okay, so they're taking it seriously.
It seems so. All right, so we've just thrown a lot of information at you.
We have. It's been a whirlwind tour of government innovation.
It has. Now it's time to put on your critical thinking hats and really examine some of these proposals. So let's start with the big one. Musk and Lutnick are talking about cutting $1 trillion in waste. And they're talking about doing it pretty quickly.
Right. They're both very ambitious timelines.
They are. So from your perspective, do you think that's realistic?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the government is a huge, complex bureaucracy.
Right. It's not like turning a speedboat around. It's more like steering an aircraft carrier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And cutting $1 trillion, that's going to require a lot more than just political will. You're going to need a really deep understanding of all the programs, all the contracts, all the regulations.
All the people who benefit from the current system.
Right. Because people are going to resist change, especially if it means they're going to lose money or power.
Exactly. So even if Musk and Lutnick are right, and there is $1 trillion of waste out there, actually finding it and cutting it, that's going to be a monumental task.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about the Doge concept, this idea of a gratis vendor, relying on donated software and expertise.
Right. So basically asking companies to do the government's work for free.
Pretty much. So do you think that's a sustainable model?
I mean, it's a nice idea in theory, but I have some concerns.
Okay, like what?
Well, first of all, you're relying on the goodwill of these companies.
Right. Like what happens if they decide they don't want to do it anymore?
Exactly. Or what if they have their own agendas,
Right. Like they're not just doing it out of the goodness of their hearts.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of security.
Right. Like who's going to make sure that these systems are secure? Who's going to maintain them? Who's going to update them?
Right. Because if something goes wrong, who's responsible?
Exactly. So it's a really interesting idea, but I think it needs a lot more thought before we can say whether it's a viable solution.
I agree.
Okay, now let's talk about AI chip manufacturing, because that was a really sobering part of the conversation.
It was. It was. And it really highlights the importance of technology in the 21st century.
Absolutely. So what do you think are the biggest risks if the U.S. loses its leadership in this area?
Well, I think the biggest risk is that we fall behind in the AI arms race.
Right. Because whoever controls AI is going to control the future.
Exactly. And if China gets ahead of us in AI, that could have huge implications for our economy, our national security, our way of life.
So it's not just about, who has the coolest gadgets. It's about who has the most powerful tools.
Right. And those tools can be used for good or for evil.
Exactly. So we need to be really strategic about how we approach AI. And we need to make sure that we're investing in the right technologies and the right people.
I agree.
Okay, now let's talk about tariffs, because that's a really complex issue with a lot of different perspectives.
It is. It is. And it's an issue that affects everyone.
Exactly. So from your perspective, what are the potential benefits and drawbacks of using tariffs as a major source of government revenue?
Well, the main benefit of tariffs is that they generate revenue for the government.
Right.
But the downside is that they can also raise prices for consumers.
Right. Because if you're putting a tariff on imported goods, those goods are going to become more expensive.
Exactly. And that can lead to inflation.
Right. So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
It is. And then there's the issue of retaliation.
Right, because if we start putting tariffs on goods from other countries, they might retaliate and put tariffs on our goods.
Nope.
Exactly. And that can lead to a trade war.
Which nobody wins.
Exactly. So it's a really delicate balance.
It is. And I think it's important to remember that tariffs are not a magic bullet.
Right. They're just one tool in the toolbox.
Exactly. All right, now let's talk about the Trump card.
Oh.
This idea of selling green cards for $5 million.
Right. So essentially letting wealthy people buy their way into America.
Pretty much. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I understand the appeal of it. From a purely financial standpoint, it would generate a lot of revenue for the government.
Right. $5 trillion if they sell 1 million cards.
Exactly. But I think there are some serious ethical considerations here.
Like what?
Well, first of all, it creates a two-tiered system where wealthy people have a huge advantage.
Right, because if you can afford to buy your way in, you don't have to go through the normal immigration process.
Exactly. And that doesn't seem very fair. No, it doesn't. And then there's the issue of security, right? Because how do you vet these people? How do you make sure that they're not criminals or terrorists or, people who are going to be a threat to national security.
Right, because you're essentially selling them access to the country.
Exactly. So it's a really risky proposition.
It is. And I think it's one that we need to be very careful about.
I agree. Okay, now let's talk about the sovereign wealth fund, because that's another really big idea.
It is. And it's one that could have a huge impact on the U.S. economy.
Absolutely. So from your perspective, what are the potential benefits and risks of this idea?
Well, the main benefit is that it could generate a lot of revenue for the government.
Right, because if the government is investing its money wisely, it could earn a good return.
Exactly. And that money could then be used to fund important programs or to pay down the national debt.
Right, but what are the risks?
Well, the biggest risk is that the government might not be very good at investing.
Right, because if they make bad investments, they could lose a lot of money.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of political interference.
Right, because if politicians start meddling in the investment decisions, it could lead to corruption or cronyism.
Exactly. So it's important to have a system in place that protects the fund from political influence.
Right. And I think it's also important to remember that a sovereign wealth fund is not a quick fix.
Right. It's a long-term investment.
Exactly. And it's going to take time to see the benefits.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. And it's been a really fascinating conversation.
It has. So let's leave our listeners with a final thought.
Okay, what's that?
Of all the ideas that we've discussed today, what do you think holds the greatest promise for the future?
That's a tough one.
It is. But if you had to pick one area where you think we could make the biggest difference, what would it be?
Well, I think the biggest opportunity lies in technology.
Technology.
Okay.
Why is that?
Well, because technology is constantly evolving, and it has the potential to transform every aspect of government.
Right. Like from how we deliver services to how we make decisions?
Exactly. And if we can harness the power of technology, we can make government more efficient, more effective, and more responsive to the needs of the people.
So it's not just about, buying the latest gadgets. It's about using technology to fundamentally change how government works.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the real potential lies.
I agree. So to our listeners out there, we challenge you to think about how technology can be used to improve government and to get involved in the conversation.
Because the future of government is in our hands.
Absolutely. All right, that's all the time we have for today, but we hope you enjoyed this deep dive.
We did, and we hope it gave you some food for thought.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.